They don't belong here. What are they even doing in a place like this? The words echoed through the summer air, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the gentle sound of waves and children's laughter. A bright, sunny afternoon on a sandy beach in Charleston, South Carolina, quickly turned dark for one family. They had come here for a rare chance to unwind, relax, and forget about the stress of everyday life. It was supposed to be a time to bond, to breathe, to be together. But their peaceful vacation was shattered in an instant by a group of uniformed men who saw something they didn't like. It wasn't about the car they were driving, the clothes they were wearing, or the bags they had brought. No, it was about the color of their skin. The officers walked over with purpose, their expressions stern and eyes filled with silent judgment. From the moment they approached, it was clear they weren't there to welcome anyone. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a smirk plastered on his face, spoke up, his voice dripping with condescension. "Hey, where are you folks from?" he said, glancing at the beach towels in the cooler with a sneer. "I don't think you're in the right place." The father, calm and composed, glanced up, momentarily confused. "We're just here to enjoy the beach, same as everyone else." But the officer didn't care. He had already decided that this family didn't belong. He stepped closer, towering over them, his hand casually resting on the handle of his baton. "This is a private beach," he lied. "You people can't just show up here and take over. Do you even know how expensive these places are?" The tension was palpable. Others nearby began to notice, whispering among themselves, unsure whether to intervene or stay back. The air was thick with discomfort. The mother clutched her son's hand tighter, a mix of fear and defiance in her eyes. She knew what was happening. She had seen it before, and she knew where it often led. "We're not doing anything wrong," she said, her voice steady but firm. "We have every right to be here." The officer's smirk faded, replaced by a hard, cold stare. "I'm not asking," he snapped. "I'm telling you. Pack up your things and leave. Now." But they didn't move. How could they? After all, they had done nothing wrong. They had simply come to enjoy a sunny day at the beach, like countless families before them. The children, still too young to fully understand, looked up at their parents, confused and scared. The father, sensing the fear in his kids, stepped forward, his tone still calm but firmer now. "We're not going anywhere. You don't have the right to treat us like this." That was when things escalated. Without a moment's hesitation, the officer radioed for backup, and soon, more patrol cars pulled up, lights flashing. People began to gather, forming a small crowd around the confrontation. Some took out their phones, recording what was quickly spiraling into an ugly, chaotic scene. More officers approached, forming a wall of authority, as if facing off against a group of dangerous criminals. But there was no crime. Just a family. Just people who wanted to spend the day by the water. The officers began to pull out identification cards, writing down the father's name, checking his license plate, asking probing, invasive questions. "What do you do for a living? Can you afford to be here? Do you even have a job?" The insults were veiled, but the meaning was clear. "You think you can just come in here, like you own the place?" one of the officers spat, his patience running thin. "We've had reports of people like you causing trouble. Just leave before we have to make you." For a moment, there was silence. An uneasy pause, like the calm before a storm. The father's eyes met the officers, and something in his expression changed. He saw the way they looked at him, not as a person, but as a problem to be removed. The officers didn't see a father, a husband, a man who worked hard every day to provide for his family. They saw a threat. And they wanted him to disappear. But then, the father did something the officers hadn't expected. He pulled out his wallet, calmly, without a word, and flashed a badge. It wasn't a local ID. It wasn't from Charleston or even the state of South Carolina. It was federal. And it carried weight. More weight than any of the officers could have imagined. The badge gleamed under the sun, revealing 3 letters that sent a ripple through the crowd: FBI. The officer who had been leading the harassment took a step back, his smirk faltering for the first time. "What is this?" he demanded, but there was a tremor in his voice now. "This is my job," the father said, his voice steady and unyielding. "And I think we're done here." But they weren't done. Not even close. Because what happened next would shock everyone. The officers, embarrassed and exposed, tried to downplay the situation, pretending it was all a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. The videos had been recorded. The people had seen. And the truth was out there. As the family walked away, heads held high, the father made a call. Just one call. And within hours, things began to unravel. The officers, still trying to save face, had no idea what was coming. They didn't know who they had just messed with. Because this wasn't just about a ruined day at the beach. It was about something much bigger. It was about accountability. Justice. And someone who wasn't afraid to fight for it. And as the days unfolded, the officers would learn, one by one, that actions have consequences. That no uniform could protect them from the truth. They had tried to humiliate an innocent family, but in doing so, they had set off a chain of events that would lead to their own downfall. A federal investigation was launched, and what it uncovered would leave the entire town in shock. But how far would it go? What secrets would be revealed? And what would happen to the officers who thought they were untouchable, only to find themselves at the center of a scandal that would destroy their careers, and maybe, even more? Stay tuned. Because this is not just a story of one family's fight. It's a story about standing up, about resilience, and about how, sometimes, the people you least expect can turn the tables in ways you never see coming. And it all started on a sunny day at the beach, with a simple, cruel command: "You don't belong here." Hey everyone, before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to our Black viewers. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice of any kind. We believe in equality, respect, and the dignity of every human being. Today's story tackles a serious issue, and we hope it sheds light on the strength, resilience, and courage that so many have shown in the face of prejudice. We appreciate you joining us, and we want you to know that your voice matters. Now, sit back, enjoy the story, and if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives. Let's get into it. Devin Scott was not a man who sought the spotlight. For him, life was about doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. Born and raised in Washington, D.C., Devin had seen the best and the worst of what the world had to offer. He had grown up in a neighborhood where the sense of community was strong, where neighbors looked out for each other, but he had also witnessed the systemic struggles that seemed to weigh on people who looked like him. It was this mix of compassion and strength that had driven him to join the FBI. Devin didn't see himself as a hero, but he believed in justice, in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. After years of working as a federal agent, Devin had earned a reputation for being sharp, thorough, and unshakably calm under pressure. He wasn't the kind of agent who rushed to conclusions. He listened, he observed, and then he acted. His colleagues admired his cool head and the way he handled complex cases with patience and precision. But those who knew him personally understood that beneath his stoic exterior, Devin was deeply empathetic, especially when it came to his family. And it was his family that had brought him to Charleston that summer. For months, his wife, Lisa, had been urging him to take a break, to step away from the relentless pace of his work and spend time with their 2 kids, Jordan and Mia. The idea of a vacation felt almost foreign to Devin. He was used to being on call, always ready to jump into action at a moment's notice. But he knew that he needed this, that they all needed this. Lisa had carefully planned the trip, choosing Charleston for its charm, its history, and, most importantly, its beaches. She envisioned days filled with sunshine, sandcastles, and laughter, the perfect escape from the busy streets of DC. Devon had smiled at her enthusiasm, but he was quietly excited too. This would be the first time in months that he could fully relax, let down his guard, and just be a dad. They arrived on a bright, clear morning, the sky a perfect shade of blue. After checking into their hotel, they made their way to the beach, arms full of towels, sunscreen, and a cooler packed with snacks. Devon's mind, usually preoccupied with cases and deadlines, was blissfully clear. He watched as Lisa spread out the blanket, while Jordan, a lively 10-year-old, sprinted toward the water with Mia, who was just 6, giggling and trailing behind him. The sight of his children's joy made Devon's heart swell with a quiet pride. This was what he had been missing, the simple, pure moments that made everything else worthwhile. Lisa was the glue that held their family together. Strong, loving, and fiercely protective, she was the kind of person who could put anyone at ease with just a smile. She had met Devon in college, and from the moment they started dating, she understood the demands of his job. It wasn't easy being married to someone whose work often required late nights and unexpected calls, but she admired his dedication. She knew that he was fighting for something bigger than himself, and that made all the sacrifices worth it. Still, she also knew when he needed to take a step back, and she wasn't afraid to remind him. As they settled in, laying out their spot on the sand, Lisa teased Devon about finally letting himself relax. "I don't think I've ever seen you this laid back," she said, nudging him playfully. "Maybe we should make this a monthly thing." Devon chuckled, pulling his baseball cap lower to shield his eyes from the sun. "Don't get too used to it," he replied, but there was a softness in his voice, a hint of gratitude that only Lisa could hear. For a while, everything was perfect. The kids built sandcastles, chasing each other around as the waves lapped at their feet. Lisa and Devon sat side by side, watching them, soaking in the peace they had craved for so long. But the tranquility was abruptly shattered when 3 police officers, clad in dark uniforms, began making their way down the beach, heading straight for them. Devon noticed them out of the corner of his eye, but he didn't think much of it at first. After all, they weren't doing anything wrong. They were just another family enjoying a day at the beach. But the officers didn't stop to chat or to check on anyone else. They walked directly to Devon and his family, their expressions stern, their movements deliberate. The lead officer, a tall man with a shaved head, looked at them with a strange mix of curiosity and disdain. "Excuse me," he said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby beachgoers. "Can I see some ID?" Devon was taken aback. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone calm but wary. He wasn't used to being questioned like this, especially not while he was off duty, surrounded by his family. The officer's eyes flicked to the cooler and the beach chairs, then back to Devon. "We've had reports of suspicious activity," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "We need to make sure everything's in order." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air. Devon's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Reports of suspicious activity? They were at the beach, like hundreds of other families, doing nothing but enjoying the sun. But he could see it now, the way the officer's gaze lingered on them, assessing, judging. He wasn't looking for trouble, he was looking for an excuse. What kind of suspicious activity? Lisa's voice cut through the silence, sharp and defiant. Devon knew that tone well. She wasn't afraid to stand up for her family, and she wasn't about to let someone intimidate her. The officer didn't answer her directly. Instead, he glanced over at his colleagues, who were now standing a few feet behind him, hands resting casually on their belts. "Just show me your ID," the officer repeated, his voice harder now, almost daring them to resist. Devon felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. He had spent years defending the law, upholding justice, and now, here he was, being treated like a criminal for no reason. But he kept his composure. With a calmness that belied the frustration he felt, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. As he handed over his ID, he caught Lisa's eye, silently reassuring her. They would get through this. But the officer wasn't satisfied. He glanced at the ID, then back at Devon, a sneer forming at the corner of his mouth. "You don't look like you belong here," he said, his words dripping with condescension. "Maybe you should find another place to hang out." The words hit Devon like a punch to the gut. He had heard stories of this kind of behavior, had read reports and seen videos, but experiencing it firsthand was something different. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like he was being scrutinized in a way he had never been before. And all around him, people were watching. Some sympathetic, others curious, but no one stepping forward to intervene. It was a moment that could have broken him, but Devon wasn't the type to break easily. He had been through too much, seen too much, to let a few words tear him down. Still, he could feel the weight of it, the humiliation, the anger. And as he stood there, holding his family close, he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They had picked the wrong family to mess with, and soon, they would find out just how wrong they were. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the beach as Devon and his family packed up their things. What should have been a relaxing day by the ocean had turned into something darker, more unsettling. The encounter with the police officers had left them shaken, and while Devon had managed to keep his composure, the tension in the air was undeniable. Lisa's expression was a mix of frustration and concern, her lips pressed into a thin line as she helped Mia into her sandals. "I don't understand why they singled us out," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder at the officers who were still lingering nearby, chatting amongst themselves as if nothing had happened. "We weren't doing anything wrong." Devon didn't respond immediately. He was replaying the interaction over in his mind, dissecting every word, every look. It wasn't just the confrontation that bothered him, it was the way they had been looked at, like they were less than everyone else on that beach. He had been in situations like this before, but it had always been different when he was in uniform, with a badge clipped to his belt. He was used to commanding respect, not pleading for basic decency. But today, he was just a father, and that shouldn't have made a difference, but it did. "They didn't see a family," he finally said, his voice low and measured. "They saw a threat. And they wanted to remind us of our place." Lisa's eyes softened as she looked at him, and for a moment, the tension between them seemed to fade. "But they don't get to decide that," she said firmly, squeezing his hand. "We belong here, just like anyone else." But the reality of the situation was hard to ignore. Jordan, who had been quiet for most of the afternoon, finally spoke up, his voice trembling with confusion and fear. "Why were they so mean, Dad? Did we do something wrong?" Devon crouched down, meeting his son's eyes. He wanted to shield Jordan from the ugliness of the world, but he also knew that pretending it didn't exist wouldn't do him any favors. "No, son," he said, his voice steady, even though his heart ached. "We didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people judge others without knowing them, and they act out of fear or ignorance. But that's on them, not us." Jordan nodded, but Devon could see the confusion still lingering in his eyes. How could he explain to a 10-year-old that the world wasn't always fair? That sometimes, even when you followed all the rules, you could still be treated as if you had broken them? Devon felt a familiar surge of anger, but he swallowed it down. This wasn't the time. As they gathered their things and began to head back to the parking lot, Devon noticed that the officers were watching them. He tried to ignore it, but it was hard to shake the feeling that they were being followed, that their every move was being scrutinized. When they reached their car, one of the officers, the same one who had demanded to see their IDs, stepped forward. "Leaving already?" he asked, his tone casual but with an edge that made it clear he wasn't asking out of politeness. "We didn't mean to scare you off." Devon didn't miss the challenge in his voice. He could feel Lisa tense beside him, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw Jordan take a step closer, as if trying to shield his little sister from whatever was about to happen. Devon took a deep breath and forced a smile, hoping to diffuse the situation. "We're just heading back to the hotel," he said, keeping his tone calm. "It's been a long day. But the officer wasn't backing down. "You know, I'm still not sure everything checks out," he said, folding his arms across his chest. "Maybe we should take another look at your IDs. Just to be safe." Devon's patience was wearing thin. He knew what was happening. This wasn't about safety or protocol, this was about power. The officer was trying to provoke him, to get him to react, to give him a reason to escalate the situation. But Devon wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. He took a step forward, meeting the officer's gaze head-on. "We've cooperated with you, we've shown you everything you asked for," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "So unless there's something else, we'll be on our way." The officer's smile faded, and for a moment, there was a tense silence. Devon could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't look away. He wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Just then, one of the other officers, a younger man who had been watching from the sidelines, stepped forward. "Hey, maybe we should just let them go," he said, his voice uncertain. "It doesn't look like they're causing any trouble." But the lead officer shot him a warning look. "I'll decide what looks like trouble," he said sharply. "And I don't like being questioned." Devon's jaw clenched. He could feel the situation slipping out of control, and he knew that if he didn't do something, it could get much worse. But before he could speak, Lisa stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "You're harassing us," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "In front of our children. What kind of example do you think you're setting?" For a moment, the officer seemed taken aback, as if he hadn't expected her to confront him so directly. But then his expression hardened. "I think it's time you left," he said, his tone colder than before. "And I think it's best if you don't come back." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Devon could feel Lisa trembling beside him, but she didn't move. She wasn't going to back down either. Devon reached for her hand, squeezing it gently, trying to convey what he couldn't say out loud. "We're leaving," he said finally, turning back to the officer. "But this isn't over." The officer raised an eyebrow, as if amused by the statement. "Oh, I think it is," he said with a smirk. "You don't want to make things worse for yourselves. Trust me." But Devon knew better. He knew that if they walked away from this without saying anything, without doing anything, then it wouldn't just be about them. It would be about every other family who had been treated the same way, every other person who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. As they drove away, Devon's mind was racing. He could still see the officer's smirk in his mind, could still hear the condescending tone in his voice. But he also knew something the officers didn't. He knew that he wasn't just a father on vacation. He was an agent of the FBI, and he had the power to make sure that this kind of behavior didn't go unpunished. When they reached the hotel, Devon pulled out his phone and made a call. He didn't say much, just a few words, spoken quietly and deliberately, but when he hung up, there was a new determination in his eyes. Lisa watched him, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Devon looked at her, and for the first time all day, he allowed himself to smile. "I'm going to make sure they remember today," he said. "And I'm going to make sure they answer for what they did." He didn't need to say anything more. Lisa could see it in his eyes, the same resolve that had drawn her to him all those years ago. She knew that whatever was coming next, it was going to be big. And as they prepared to settle in for the night, a quiet sense of anticipation filled the room, like the calm before a storm. Because Devon wasn't done. Not by a long shot. And soon, neither would be the officers who thought they could get away with it. The following morning, the air was thick with a sense of anticipation, as if the city itself knew that something was about to happen. Devon was up before dawn, sitting on the balcony of their hotel room, staring out at the ocean as the first hints of sunlight began to spill over the horizon. He hadn't slept much, his mind buzzing with everything that had happened the day before. But he wasn't tired. If anything, he felt more awake than he had in a long time. There was a quiet determination in his eyes, the kind that only came from knowing what needed to be done and having the means to do it. By the time the rest of his family was awake, Devon was dressed, his phone already buzzing with messages. Lisa watched him from across the room, noticing the way he moved, the subtle shift in his demeanor. He wasn't the relaxed, vacationing dad anymore. He was back in work mode, but this time, there was a personal edge to it. "Devon," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "What did you do?" He looked up, meeting her eyes, and for a moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty. But then he took a breath and spoke, his voice calm, steady. "I made a few calls. Last night, I contacted my team, and I gave them everything they need to start an investigation into what happened. The videos, the names, the details. This isn't going to get swept under the rug, Lisa." She didn't respond immediately, trying to process the weight of his words. "Are you sure this is the right way? I mean, they're just going to deny everything. They'll say we were exaggerating, or worse, make up some excuse to justify it." Devon's expression hardened. "They can try. But they won't be able to hide from this. Not this time." As they spoke, Devon's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and saw a message that made him smile, a small, triumphant smile that told Lisa everything she needed to know. "They're here," he said, slipping the phone into his pocket. "It's time to go." A short drive later, they arrived at the local police station, the same place where those officers had strutted out from the day before, full of arrogance and unchecked authority. But today, the mood was different. Devon could feel it as soon as they stepped out of the car. There were more people outside than usual, reporters with cameras, bystanders with their phones out, and a cluster of law enforcement vehicles parked out front. Devon led his family inside, walking through the doors with a calm confidence that made heads turn. As they entered the lobby, they were greeted by a familiar face, Special Agent Reynolds, a colleague from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Reynolds was a seasoned investigator, with a sharp, no-nonsense attitude that made it clear he didn't play games. He extended a hand to Devon, giving him a firm, reassuring nod. "Good to see you, Devon," he said. "We've been waiting for you. The team's already set up." Devon nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. "Let's get this started," he replied. "I want this handled by the book. No shortcuts, no loose ends." As they made their way down the hallway, Reynolds glanced over at Devon's family, his expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry you all had to go through this," he said quietly. "But I promise, we're going to make it right." When they reached the conference room, Devon's heart skipped a beat. Inside, he saw several monitors set up, each displaying live footage from different parts of the station. Officers were being interviewed, files were being examined, and everything was being recorded. This wasn't just an internal investigation, this was a full-scale operation. Devon's team had been thorough, and it was clear they intended to leave no stone unturned. Reynolds gestured to a monitor showing a live feed of the lead officer from the beach, sitting in an interrogation room, looking visibly uncomfortable. "We're starting with him," he said. "He thinks this is just a routine follow-up, but I think he's starting to realize it's a lot more than that." Devon's eyes were locked on the screen, watching as the officer shifted in his chair, trying to maintain a facade of confidence. He recognized that face, that same smirk from the beach, but it was different now, nervous, unsure. "What's the plan?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Devon turned to her, his expression serious but calm. "We're going to ask questions, and we're going to get answers. And if they lie, we'll have the evidence to prove it." Inside the interrogation room, the officer sat with his arms crossed, his jaw set as he faced two federal agents. "I don't understand why I'm here," he said, his voice defensive. "We were just doing our job. There was a call about suspicious behavior, and we responded. That's standard procedure." One of the agents, a woman with a calm, composed demeanor, leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. Standard procedure, she repeated, her tone neutral but pointed. Is it standard procedure to target families without any evidence of wrongdoing? To make them feel unwelcome in a public space? The officer's eyes flickered, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his expression. Look, I don't know what you're trying to imply, but we didn't do anything wrong. We were just following up on a report. The agent raised an eyebrow. A report that never existed, she said, sliding a file across the table. We checked the records. There were no calls made about suspicious activity on that beach yesterday. So tell me, where did this report come from? The room was silent for a moment, and Devon watched from the other side of the monitor, his pulse quickening. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the truth would start to unravel. The officer hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. I don't know, maybe someone mentioned something in passing. It's hard to remember the exact details. The agent didn't let him off the hook. We have multiple witnesses who recorded the entire incident, she said, her tone unyielding. And their accounts don't match yours. So I'm going to ask you again, why did you target that family? The officer's face reddened, his composure starting to crack. It wasn't like that, he muttered, but the confidence in his voice was fading. We thought they might be up to something. It's our job to be cautious. Reynolds leaned in, his eyes sharp. Cautious, he repeated. Or prejudiced. The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The officer looked like he had been punched, his eyes widening as he tried to formulate a response. I'm not racist, he said, but even as he said the words, they sounded hollow. I don't judge people based on their race. Then why were there no other families questioned that day, the agent asked. Why were only they singled out? As the questions continued, the officer's facade crumbled. Devon could see it, the way his expression changed, the way he struggled to keep his story straight. And then, the breaking point came, a small slip, a stutter in his words as he tried to explain himself, and suddenly, the room was flooded with questions. Why did you lie on your report? Who told you to target them? Do you realize the consequences of falsifying a report? Back in the conference room, Devon could feel his heart pounding. This was it. They were getting closer, and the truth was coming to light. The officer's stammering grew more frantic, and finally, he broke. All right, he shouted, slamming his hands on the table. Maybe we overstepped. Maybe we thought they didn't belong there, okay? But it's not like we hurt anyone. The admission was chilling in its simplicity. It wasn't an apology, or even an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, it was an attempt to justify the unjustifiable. But Devon didn't need an apology. He needed accountability, and now, he had it. Reynolds' voice was calm as he spoke. Thank you for your honesty. But understand this, what you did wasn't just overstepping. It was a violation of civil rights, and it's not going to go unanswered. The officer's eyes widened, realization dawning on him as the implications of his words sank in. Wait, you're not serious, are you? You can't charge us for this. We were just doing our jobs. Reynolds stood up, his expression resolute. No, you were abusing your power. And now, you're going to face the consequences. As Devon watched the scene unfold, he felt a sense of vindication, but also a deep sadness. This was never how it should have been. But at least now, there was a chance to set things right. As they left the station, Lisa squeezed his hand, and for the first time since this all began, she smiled, a small, hopeful smile that made Devon's heart swell. But this was just the beginning. The investigation was far from over, and as the officers were led away, Devon knew that there were still more questions to be answered, more truths to uncover. And as the cameras outside flashed, capturing every moment, one thing was clear, the world was about to see the real story. The sun was high in the sky, casting harsh, unrelenting light over the police station's parking lot. It was a strange contrast to the dark, tense atmosphere inside the building, where truths were being dragged out into the open, inch by inch. Devon stood beside Lisa, watching as reporters jostled for position, their cameras aimed at the entrance, ready to capture the moment when the officers would be escorted out. This wasn't just another story, it was becoming a symbol of something larger, a reckoning that had been a long time coming. Inside, the interrogation continued, and Devon could feel the weight of every word as if he were in that room himself. The officers, who had strutted so confidently just a day before, were now subdued, their bravado cracking under the relentless pressure of questioning. Every denial was met with evidence, every excuse dismantled by witnesses, and it was clear that there was no easy way out. Devon's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Reynolds. He's about to name names. You'll want to hear this. He glanced at Lisa, who nodded, her eyes reflecting the same steely determination he felt. Go, she said softly. I'll be right here. As Devon stepped into the viewing room, he saw Reynolds standing in front of the monitor, arms crossed, watching the lead officer on the screen. The man looked different now, his shoulders slumped, eyes darting nervously around the room, as if looking for an escape that wasn't there. Two FBI agents sat across from him, their expressions calm, but there was no mistaking the intensity in their eyes. This was more than just an investigation, it was a hunt for the truth. I'm telling you, I didn't decide this on my own, the officer said, his voice shaky, almost pleading. We got a directive. Someone higher up told us to keep an eye out for certain people. One of the agents leaned forward, her gaze sharp. What do you mean, certain people? The officer hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find the right words. You know, families like that. We were told they might cause trouble, that it's better to intervene early than to let things escalate. Devon's jaw tightened as he listened, a bitter taste rising in his mouth. He knew what the officer meant, even if he didn't say it outright. They weren't targeting criminals, they were targeting people who didn't look like they belonged. It was profiling, pure and simple, and it was a disgrace to everything Devon had spent his career fighting against. Who gave you that directive? The agent pressed, not letting up. Was it your supervisor? The officer swallowed hard, his eyes flicking nervously to the camera. It came from higher up than that. I'm not saying it was right, but we were just following orders. You have to understand, it wasn't personal. Not personal, the other agent said, his voice rising slightly. You humiliated an innocent family in front of their children, and you're telling us that wasn't personal? Who was it personal to then? Because it sure looked personal to them. The officer's face flushed, and he looked down at the table, unable to meet the agent's eyes. I'm just a patrol officer, he muttered. I didn't make the rules. Reynolds turned to Devon, his expression grim. They're trying to pass the buck, he said quietly. But if we can get him to name his superior, we might be able to expose the entire chain of command. Devon nodded, his mind racing. This wasn't just about a few rogue officers, it was about a system that allowed this kind of behavior to thrive, unchecked. And if they could bring that system down, then maybe, just maybe, they could prevent this from happening to someone else. Back in the interrogation room, the tension was palpable. The agents leaned in, closing the distance between themselves and the officer, their voices low but firm, leaving no room for evasion. We need a name, the female agent said, her eyes locked on the officers. If you cooperate, it could help your case. But if you keep stonewalling, you're going to be the one who takes the fall. The officer looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and desperation. For a moment, it seemed like he might hold out, that he might cling to the last shreds of his defiance. But then, he sighed, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. It was Captain Harrington, he said finally, the words coming out in a rush. He told us to watch out for potential disturbances, and he made it clear who he was talking about. I didn't question it because no one ever does. You don't question the captain. Devon's heart skipped a beat. He had heard that name before. Captain Harrington was a high-ranking officer, well-connected and known for his tough stance on law and order. But Devon also knew that there had been whispers about him, rumors of misconduct, of quietly sweeping certain cases under the rug. Reynolds didn't waste a second. "Get Harrington in here," he said, his voice sharp. "I want to hear what he has to say." The room was silent as they waited. Devon could feel the tension building, coiling tighter with every passing second. This was it. This was the moment that would determine whether they could crack the facade, whether they could expose the rot beneath the surface. When Captain Harrington finally entered the room, he carried himself with the same air of authority that had made him so untouchable for years. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes as he took in the scene, the cameras, the agents, and Devon, standing silently in the corner, watching him with a gaze that was impossible to read. "I understand you have some questions," Harrington said, his voice smooth, as if he was used to diffusing situations like this. "But I want to make it clear that my officers were acting in accordance with department policy. Any suggestion to the contrary is unfounded." The female agent didn't hesitate. "We have evidence that suggests otherwise, Captain," she said, her tone calm but unyielding. "We have testimonies, recordings, and now we have names. You might want to reconsider your stance." Harrington's expression tightened, but he didn't falter. "I'm aware of what my officers said. But I assure you, any actions taken were in the interest of maintaining public safety." "Public safety?" Devon spoke up for the first time, his voice cutting through the room. "Or control? Because from where I was standing, it looked like you were more interested in making a statement than protecting anyone." Harrington's eyes flicked to Devon, and for a moment, the mask slipped. "Mr. Scott, I understand that you might feel," Agent Scott, Devon interrupted, his voice cold. "And I think you know exactly how I feel. I want to know why you instructed your officers to target my family. Was it public safety, or was it prejudice?" The words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. Harrington's face darkened, and his gaze hardened into a glare. "You're out of line," he said quietly. "This is a misunderstanding, and you're blowing it out of proportion. There's nothing wrong with being cautious. But there is something wrong with abuse," Devon shot back, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "And there's something very wrong with using your position to intimidate and harass innocent people. So don't stand there and tell me this was about caution. This was about power, and you abused it." Harrington opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Reynolds stepped in. "Captain Harrington, your officers have already given statements implicating you. This is your chance to explain your actions, but I suggest you choose your words carefully." For the first time, a flicker of fear crossed Harrington's face. He glanced around the room, as if looking for support, but found none. The walls were closing in, and he could feel it. "Fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I told them to be cautious. Maybe I said a few things that were misunderstood. But I was just trying to keep things under control." "Under control?" Devon repeated, his voice quiet but deadly. "You call what happened to my family under control? You humiliated us, you tried to make us feel small, and you thought you could get away with it because no one would question you. But I'm questioning you now, and I'm not going to stop until I get answers." Harrington's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, it seemed like he might explode. But then, he slumped back in his chair, the fight draining out of him. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said, his voice raw, as if admitting the truth for the first time. "We were just trying to keep things orderly. It's a delicate balance, you know. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions." "No," Devon said, stepping forward, his eyes burning with a quiet fury. "You don't make decisions like that. Not at the cost of someone else's dignity. You had a choice, and you chose to discriminate. And now you're going to face the consequences." The room was silent, the weight of Devon's words settling over everyone. Harrington's shoulders sagged, and he looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. It was over, and he knew it. As the agents led Harrington out of the room, Devon turned to Reynolds, a sense of relief washing over him. "It's not enough," he said quietly. "But it's a start." Reynolds nodded, placing a hand on Devon's shoulder. "You did good, Devon. You stood up, and you made them listen. That's how change starts." And as Devon walked out of the station, past the cameras and the flashing lights, he knew that this was just the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Because now, the world was watching, and there would be no more hiding. As Devon stepped out of the police station, the sun was blinding, reflecting off the sea of camera lenses pointed at the entrance. Reporters shouted questions, hoping to catch a soundbite, a hint of the story that had clearly become bigger than anyone had anticipated. Devon squinted against the light, feeling the weight of the day starting to press down on him. The confrontation with Captain Harrington had been intense, but it was just the beginning of what would be a long and arduous process. The truth was out, but justice was still a distant goal. Lisa stood waiting for him by their car, her expression a mix of pride and concern. She knew Devon had done what needed to be done, but she also understood the toll it had taken. He approached her, managing a small, tired smile. "It's not over yet," he said, his voice low, as if to remind himself as much as her. "But we've made a start." "You did more than that," she replied, squeezing his hand. "You made sure they couldn't just walk away from this." As they drove back to their hotel, the radio stations buzzed with reports of the unfolding investigation. It was clear that the news had spread quickly, Captain Harrington's name was on everyone's lips, and the details of his actions were being dissected by every commentator and analyst in the city. It was surreal to hear, like a story from another world. But for Devon, it was deeply personal, and every word reminded him of why he had to keep pushing forward. Back at the hotel, Devon's phone buzzed continuously with calls and messages. Some were from colleagues, offering support or asking for details, while others were from media outlets wanting an exclusive interview. He ignored most of them, his mind still processing everything that had happened. Instead, he focused on the messages from his team, detailing the next steps in the investigation. There was so much more to uncover, and Devon knew that Harrington was just the tip of the iceberg. Over the next few days, the investigation expanded. The FBI's Civil Rights Division launched a formal inquiry into the police department, reviewing internal communications, incident reports, and surveillance footage. What they found was shocking, even to seasoned investigators. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents of misconduct, it was a pattern, a culture of prejudice that had been allowed to flourish, hidden behind the guise of community safety. Officers, emboldened by the lack of accountability, had targeted minorities with impunity, knowing that their actions would rarely be questioned. As the investigation deepened, more officers were implicated. Some came forward voluntarily, admitting their involvement in practices they now claimed to regret, while others were exposed through damning evidence, emails, recordings, and witness testimonies that painted a picture of systematic discrimination. It became clear that this wasn't just about the actions of a few individuals, it was about a system that had been designed to shield those in power from facing the consequences of their actions. Devon attended every briefing, listening as the details were laid out, one by one. He could see the faces of the officers on the screens, some familiar, others he had never seen before, but all connected by the same threads of complicity. It was infuriating, but it was also vindicating. For so long, people like him had been made to feel like their experiences were just misunderstandings, anomalies in an otherwise fair system. Now, the world was seeing the truth, and there was no way to ignore it anymore. One afternoon, as Devon was preparing to head to yet another meeting with Reynolds, he received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering, unsure of what to expect. "Mr. Scott," said a voice on the other end, unfamiliar but calm. "My name is Linda Carter. I'm a public defender, and I represent several officers from the department, including Captain Harrington. I was hoping we could speak. Devin's grip tightened on the phone. I'm not sure what you think I can do for you, Ms. Carter, he said, his tone guarded. Your clients are facing serious charges, and I'm not inclined to negotiate. I understand that, she replied, her voice steady. But this isn't about negotiation. I think there's more to this story than what's being reported, and I believe you want the truth as much as I do. I'd like to meet with you, if you're willing to hear me out. Devin hesitated. He had no reason to trust her, but something in her tone made him pause. Maybe there was more to uncover, something he hadn't seen yet. All right, he said finally. But this isn't a deal. If you're trying to get me to back off, you're wasting your time. I'm not, she assured him. I'll see you at the courthouse tomorrow morning. The next day, Devin found himself sitting across from Linda Carter in a small, nondescript office at the courthouse. She was composed, her demeanor professional but not unfriendly. She got straight to the point, wasting no time on pleasantries. I'm not here to defend what happened, she began. What those officers did was wrong, and they will face the consequences. But I need you to understand something, Harrington wasn't acting alone. There are people above him who have been using this department to further their own agenda, and they're trying to make Harrington the scapegoat to protect themselves. Devin leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. And why should I believe you? Linda met his gaze without flinching. Because I have evidence, she said, pulling a small USB drive from her bag and sliding it across the table. Emails, memos, directives, everything you need to prove that this goes all the way up the chain. They knew what was happening, and they let it continue because it served their interests. Devin picked up the drive, turning it over in his hand. Why are you giving me this? He asked. If you're representing them, why would you hand over evidence that could implicate your own clients? Linda sighed, and for the first time, Devin saw a hint of weariness in her eyes. Because I believe in justice, Mr. Scott, even when it's inconvenient. I took an oath to uphold the law, and I can't stand by and watch this play out knowing that the real perpetrators are going to walk away free. Harrington and his officers are guilty, but they're not the masterminds. If you want real change, you need to expose the whole network, not just a few bad apples. Devin felt a surge of conflicting emotions. He wanted to see Harrington and the others held accountable, but if there was a larger conspiracy at play, ignoring it would mean letting the true architects of this corruption slip away. He looked at Linda, searching for any sign of deception, but all he saw was a quiet determination. All right, he said slowly. I'll take a look. But if this is some kind of trick, it's not, she interrupted. You have my word. That night, Devin sat in his hotel room, his laptop open in front of him as he scrolled through the files on the USB drive. What he found was staggering: emails from senior officials, instructing Harrington to target minority communities under the guise of proactive policing. Memos that outlined strategies for how to suppress reports of misconduct, how to manipulate statistics to make it seem like crime rates were rising, justifying their aggressive tactics. It was a coordinated effort, a system designed to maintain control through fear and manipulation. As he read, Devin felt a wave of disgust wash over him. This wasn't just about a few rogue officers, this was about an entire system that had been weaponized to maintain a status quo. And it wasn't just local, it was tied to state officials, even politicians who had built their careers on the promise of law and order, using fear to gain power. Devin knew what he had to do. He called Reynolds, briefing him on what he had discovered. We need to expand the investigation, he said, his voice firm. This isn't just a police issue. We're dealing with a network of corruption, and we need to bring it all down. Reynolds was silent for a moment before he responded. This is going to be messy, Devin. If we go after this, it's going to make a lot of enemies. Are you ready for that? I didn't come this far to back down now, Devin replied. I'm ready. The next few days were a blur of meetings, briefings, and strategy sessions. The investigation was widened, and subpoenas were issued for records that had previously been off-limits. The media picked up on the shift, and soon, the story was no longer just about a few officers on a power trip, it was about a network of corruption that spanned across the state, involving officials who had once been considered untouchable. And then came the moment Devon had been waiting for. One by one, names started to surface: politicians, business leaders, senior law enforcement officials. People who had used their power to manipulate the system, who had given the orders that led to incidents like the one on the beach, all in the name of keeping control. It was a domino effect, and as the pieces fell, the true extent of the conspiracy was revealed. As Devon stood outside the courthouse, watching as another round of arrests was made, he felt a sense of closure. It wasn't over yet, there would be trials, appeals, and undoubtedly, backlash. But for now, he had done what he set out to do. He had exposed the truth, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like justice was within reach. But the road ahead was still uncertain, and Devon knew that there were more battles to be fought. As he turned to Lisa, who had been by his side through it all, he saw the same determination reflected in her eyes. "We did it," she said softly, but there was a question in her voice, as if asking what came next. Devon nodded, his expression resolute. "We did. But we're not done yet." And as they walked away from the courthouse, hand in hand, Devon knew that the fight for justice was just beginning. The final wave of arrests marked the end of a long, grueling battle. Devon watched from a distance as state officials, local politicians, and senior police officers were led away in handcuffs, their faces grim, their once untouchable power shattered. The investigation had unveiled a vast network of corruption, and now, the consequences were clear for all to see. What began as a single act of injustice on a sunny beach had grown into a reckoning, bringing down an entire system that had hidden behind a veil of authority for far too long. For Captain Harrington, there was no redemption. He was sentenced to prison for his role in orchestrating discriminatory practices, and as he stood before the judge, there was no trace of the arrogance he once carried. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his attempts to deflect responsibility only made his fall harder. In the end, Harrington became a symbol, not of strength, but of the dangers of unchecked power and prejudice. His conviction sent a message, one that echoed far beyond the walls of the courtroom: no one is above accountability. For the officers who had followed Harrington's orders, the outcomes were mixed. Some, like the lead officer from the beach incident, pleaded guilty, admitting their mistakes and cooperating with the investigation. Their cooperation led to lighter sentences, but the damage to their careers and reputations was irreversible. Others fought the charges, refusing to accept responsibility, and found themselves facing harsher penalties. Their stubbornness only served to deepen the public's understanding of how deep the rot had gone. But perhaps the most surprising turn came from Linda Carter, the public defender who had handed Devon the crucial evidence. Her decision to expose the network's operations cost her professionally, as she was ostracized by many of her colleagues. Yet, she found a new purpose in the aftermath of the investigation, dedicating herself to advocating for legal reforms. She became a vocal supporter of civil rights, pushing for policies that would ensure accountability and prevent the kind of abuse that had occurred under Harrington's watch. Her courage in speaking out, even when it meant going against her own clients, earned her respect and admiration, and she became a key figure in the fight for change. As for Devon, the outcome was more than he could have hoped for. He didn't seek fame or recognition, but his role in bringing down the network of corruption was undeniable. The FBI awarded him a commendation for his perseverance and integrity, and he was offered a promotion, one that would place him in a position to lead future civil rights investigations. It was a fitting acknowledgement, but Devon's greatest satisfaction came from knowing that he had stood up for his family, for justice, and that he had made a difference. On the day the final verdicts were announced, Devon took his family back to that same beach in Charleston. The sun was shining, the waves lapping gently against the shore, and for the first time since their vacation had begun, Devon felt a sense of peace. As he watched Jordan and Mia run along the sand, laughing and carefree, he turned to Lisa, who was standing beside him, a soft smile on her lips. "It's over," she said, her voice filled with relief. "You did it." Devon nodded, but his expression was thoughtful. "We did it," he corrected, wrapping an arm around her. "I couldn't have done this without you." The beach was quiet, but it felt different now. It was no longer a place of confrontation or fear, it was a place of victory, of resilience. Devon knew that there were still challenges ahead, that the fight for equality was far from over. But for now, he could breathe easy, knowing that they had taken a stand, and that the world had listened. And so, this story ends not just with justice, but with a message, a reminder that standing up against injustice is never easy, but it's always worth it. Devon's fight was not just for his family, but for everyone who has been made to feel like they don't belong, for everyone who has been told to stay silent in the face of wrong. His journey shows us that sometimes, even when the odds seem stacked against us, we have the power to make a change. It's easy to feel powerless in a world where systems seem so big and unmovable. But what Devon's story teaches us is that change starts with courage, with the decision to speak up and refuse to accept things as they are. It's about fighting not just for yourself, but for those who come after, so that they can live in a world that is a little bit fairer, a little bit kinder. What about you? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult? How did it feel? We'd love to hear your stories and thoughts in the comments below. Sharing experiences can be a powerful way to inspire others to find their own courage, and who knows, maybe your story could be the spark that someone else needs. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of resilience, justice, and unexpected twists, please make sure to subscribe to our channel, Tales of Twist. Hit the like button, share your thoughts, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. We have many more powerful stories to share, and we'd love for you to be a part of them. See you next time.